Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessler, thanks for joining us. So how would you describe the recent voting restrictions passed in more than a dozen states?
I think it's terrifying. Honestly, it's probably the biggest threat to our democracy that I've seen in my lifetime.
The letter you signed today, or the letter you signed, is calling for, quote, legislation protecting against both voter suppression and election subversion. How are both possible?
Well, our democracy works best when all eligible voters are provided with the right to vote and the ability to vote. So, in 2018, what the voters of the state of Michigan did in passing Proposal 3 is we tried to make it as easy as possible for people to vote. And when I say that, I mean no reason absentee voting. Look at how many people were unable to vote because they simply had to work on election day. And for people who live in very populous areas, couldn't stand in line for hours and hours on end just to exercise the fundamental right to vote in an election. And so we worked hard in Michigan to make it easier for people so that you could vote absentee, so that you can vote through the mail. We expanded the use of drop boxes. So counties did that all around the state of Michigan so that it was easier for people to vote. In Michigan, we made it easy for municipalities to have funding so that they could have return postage. Because there are a lot of people who just don't have a stamp laying around in their household. And we don't want that to be the reason why a person doesn't exercise their right to vote. But following the false claims of election fraud, which were demonstrated to absolutely be untrue, it was used as an excuse by legislature after legislature after legislature to restrict voting rights for people. And that's happened in a multitude of states. And in sometimes it's a matter of making it much more difficult to cast your ballot. In other states, it's a matter of making it easier to overturn the election results, which is incredibly frightening. What's the point of having a democracy in the first place if you can take the individual who received the most votes and to say that there's a way to subvert that in terms of ensuring that the person who got fewer votes actually becomes the winner of the election? Why are we voting at all if that's the case? But that's what we're starting to see in various different states. And that's why myself and 21 other attorneys general are pleading with the United States Senate to pass the For the People Act, even if it means having to change procedures and to eliminate the filibuster in this case. There are 50 votes for certain for this, but of course, based on the current protocols in the Senate, you need 60 votes because of the filibuster. And we think that this is a matter of such great and utmost importance that even if it means eliminating the filibuster, it's something that absolutely has to be done, because if it's not, pretty soon we're not going to have a democracy anymore.
And
I don't care if you're a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, or some other political affiliation or no political affiliation at all. Every eligible voter deserves the right to vote and deserves to know that the person who received the most votes will be the winner of that election.
And if I may, recent polling shows nearly a third of all Americans may believe that the 2020 election was stolen from former President Donald Trump. Should that lack of confidence by that large of a portion of Americans, should that almost push for some of these states passing legislation on election fraud, even if it is just symbolic?
Yeah, but you can't create a false narrative and then create laws structured around something that is a false narrative and that is demonstrably untrue. There were dozens and dozens of cases, not just in the state of Michigan, but of course in states all around the nation following the 2020 election. And whether it was a judge that was appointed by a Democrat or appointed by a Republican, every single one of those judges ruled in the same way and said that these claims of election fraud were demonstrably false. There was no truth to it at all whatsoever. And so why would you legislate around a lie, which is exactly what they're trying to do, to say, well, we've convinced a lot of people that something that's not true is true. So now we need new legislation to address this falsity. It makes no sense. Don't we want to legislate around truth? Don't we want to legislate around that which is demonstrably true and that is statistically the case, and not something that is a rumor? I mean,
And if I may,
it's
some of the
really
legislation
concerning.
that has been introduced in Michigan, specifically one bill requiring a driver's license or state ID to get a mail-in ballot, others allowing only provisional ballots for people voting in person without an ID. How, in your estimation, is this overstepping?
Well, for instance, when you first register to vote, you need to have that ID to begin with. So to say then that when you are requesting an absentee ballot, that you also have to send in, say, a copy of your driver's license, I think that is overreaching. It's assuming that people have photocopiers at their house. It's having to put personal information into something that's going to the clerk's office that leaves one susceptible to identity theft. And there's literally no reason for it, because what we know to be the case is we had virtually no fraud in the 2020 election, and certainly nothing on the level that would have changed any election results at all. And we know that to be the case. It was the most safe and secure election that we've had in the history of the United States, and the most successful, I would submit, based on the fact that 5.5 million Michigan residents legally voted. And so why would we take measures to make it more difficult for people to vote when there's no evidence of fraud whatsoever? Don't we want everyone who's eligible to vote to be able to have that opportunity? Why are we taking these measures to make it harder for people to vote? And again, let me say this, it's not just going to make it harder for Democrats to vote. This is going to make it harder for Republicans to vote as well. These are voter suppression laws. There's no two ways about it. And that's why it's so critically important that we move forward and we have some federal protections that are put in place that tell the states that they absolutely cannot engage in this type of voter suppression and in measures that would, cause us to really have a significant erosion of our democratic systems of elections. It makes no sense whatsoever, and it's going to be incredibly detrimental to our democratic norms in this country.
Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.